Welcome everyone. This is our third episode of our Economics 101 series, which is run jointly with ECU, and we'll be focusing on tax and why it matters for the climate. We're delighted to be joined by Caitlin Boswell, who is the Head of Advocacy and Policy at Tax Justice UK. With the autumn budget fast approaching, we're really glad that Caitlin can join us to shed some light on the political debates and myths surrounding tax, when and why tax rises are necessary for progress on environmental action, and more. Before we begin, I've got the usual reminders for you all to please pop your names and organisations into your Zoom profiles. We are also recording this session and we'll be uploading it to our website along with speaker slides afterwards. Caitlin's presenting for the first 20 minutes or so of this session, and we'll have plenty of time at the end for any questions that you might have. So thanks, Caitlin, for being here, and I'll pass over to you to start us off.
Thanks so much. And yeah, thanks very much for having me. Really nice to see you all. I'm Caitlin, Head of Advocacy and Policy at Tax Justice UK. I've shared some slides, so I'll let you know when to go through to the next one. This is just an intro one, so you can click straight through. Great. So yeah, as I'm sure everyone is aware, the budget is coming up very soon. We've got the budget coming up on the 26th of November. And we're hearing reports and have been for a while now of the sizable fiscal challenge that the Chancellor is facing. We try and stay away from language of black hole or fiscal hole, but that is often what you hear this called. And reports are saying that this will need to be anything from between 30 to 50 billion. So Rachel Reeves will be expected to find around that amount of money to balance the books, which means that there are basically three main ways that this can be done. Either increasing taxes to raise revenue, making cuts to public services or wider spending cuts, or relying on economic growth. And I think everyone can be in agreement that no one wants to see more austerity cuts to our already very weakened public services after 14 years of austerity measures under the Tories. And this quite abstract notion of economic growth takes a long time. So tax rises were already looking very likely, and it's what we've been sort of banking on. But just last week, you may have seen on Friday reports that the Chancellor confirmed that that both tax rises and spending cuts will be part of the picture, and that specifically tax rises on the wealthy will feature in the budget. So that was not the spending cut side of things, but the raising taxes on the wealthy, and hearing her explicitly mention this was very interesting for us. I mean, it remains to be seen how progressive that will look, but it's positive to have it confirmed that will be part of the story. So I would say that the main political debate now is no longer will the Treasury raise taxes, will the Chancellor raise taxes, but instead, who will they raise taxes on and how progressive will these be? Yeah, you can skip to the next slide now. So this is a very general point, and I'm sure many of you will be well aware of this, all of everything that I'm sort of talking through today. But in terms of why we need to raise taxes, both in general and to progress climate and environmental action. So in the context of climate change and the climate emergency, I would say that progressive tax reform provides an answer to the often asked question of how will we pay for this? So it can provide a really useful sort of tangible solution or answer to this question. And I think that's why it's really brilliant to see. I've been working in the new economy space for just over a year, but to see the increasing amount of collaboration between the climate and new economy sectors and movements is really positive, because I think, yeah, we're all going to need to be working more closely together as we sort of tackle these interconnected issues of a broken economy and a climate emergency. As we know, taxes pay for literally everything in terms of the public sector. So from staffing and maintaining our public services, investing in public infrastructure like roads, railway, to raising living standards and tackling inequality in the longer term, and funding climate action, including a just and fair transition for workers both at home and overseas. We at Tax Justice and with our partners that we've worked alongside around climate and tax see these three things as really inextricably linked. Sort of functioning public services, good living standards, and climate action. We think, yeah, the three things are very linked in and of themselves, and therefore the solution that we propose and how we tackle these issues has to be interconnected as well. Yeah, if you could move to the next slide, please. So the main reason that we think of it like this is this isn't specific to us, and many others are working on this, including the Make Polluters Pay Coalition, who are doing a lot of work in this area, but looking at the climate crisis through the lens of a cost of living crisis. So according to Global Witness, climate change is currently costing each UK household £3,000 a year. So that's costs from things like flooding, global crop losses, rising insurance, rising energy bills, and more, and means that the high cost of essentials is here to stay if action isn't taken. And this kind of relentless snowballing of prices and costs hits low families hardest, who are, as we know, the least responsible for the pollution causing climate breakdown. I've added in just a picture of this report by the Good Ancestor Movement and the Patriotic Millionaires called The Risks of Extreme Wealth, which I would really recommend people check out if you haven't seen it before. It outlines the 7 risks of extreme wealth: democracy, media, law, economy, social cohesion, environment, and equality. And the risks to environment and equality are what we work and think the most on, and what I'll be talking the most about today. And it's basically shows that like it's extreme wealth is this thing that doesn't just coexist alongside everything else in the economy, but it inherently causes harm in all these areas. And the more and more that wealth is hoarded or and extracted by an ever shrinking number of people, the less well off the rest of us are. So some stats just to kind of really bring that out. As it stands, the richest 50 families, sorry, in the UK currently hold more wealth than the bottom 50%, the poorer 50% of the population. And this stat from Oxfam GB that the 50 richest billionaires, that should say in the world, for that one, the 50 richest billionaires in the world produced more carbon in 3 hours last year than the average Brit does in an entire lifetime, which is pretty shocking statistic. So just showing there some of the connections between extreme wealth and climate breakdown. You can go to the next one. Thanks. So this next slide, there's going to be a fair bit of information, so I'll try and keep it not too technical, and we can have a discussion about some of it after. But in thinking about sort of which taxes, the question was asked of which taxes are most important for people working on climate and environment to understand. I mean, I would say that all of them are like our work focuses on taxing wealth more. So I would say that this as an area is a really important and interesting one to connect to the climate movement and tackling climate change. And you will have heard of sort of making polluters pay policies, taxes that are aimed at ensuring that the biggest and richest polluters pay for climate action, pay their fair share. We want to think of the biggest and richest polluters slightly more broadly than just the traditionally understood sort of fossil fuel companies, but also the super rich individuals who are disproportionately fueling the climate crisis through excessive consumption, extraction, and damage, and their very harmful investment choices and lifestyles. So luxury travel, private jets, luxury yachts, this kind of thing. In term and the reason we focus on the policy asks that we do is because in the short, they're both short-term revenue raisers that could raise significant money for our public services, our living standards, and funding climate action. But all of the policies that we advocate for would also bring about structural changes to the tax system, which is really crucial. So they're not just revenue raisers, which is obviously important, but they would create structural change within our tax system, which in the longer term would reduce wealth inequality and reduce climate emissions. So, two really crucial things in the longer term. So, just as some examples, if we're thinking about the most polluting companies, again, things that I'm sure many of you have worked on and are well aware of, but one of these policies is around ending and redirecting fossil fuel subsidies to raise around 2 billion a year. And yeah, I know that Uplifter on this call will know far more on this than me, but just really shocking to see how much support the UK government still provides to the fossil fuel industry in 2025. And that to us seems like a relatively low hanging fruit and should be something that a Labour government should not be sort of delaying action on. Um, Also, we're calling to make the energy profits levy a permanent excess profits approach so that it captures all excess profits and not just windfalls. And I know that the government has a consultation on the mechanism for a permanent, how it should be designed, the permanent mechanism, which is encouraging to see. So hopefully this is something that I would be hopeful that we could see in the budget, or at least not long after. Things like adding a tax on shareholders of fossil fuel companies or establishing a climate damages tax on oil and gas extraction. This is something that is more ambitious, a longer term goal. There isn't so much political buy-in currently for this, apart from the sort of further left of the Labour Party or the Greens. And this levy would incrementally increase and enable a managed transition away from North Sea oil and gas whilst generating crucial funds for climate action and worker transition programs. And according to Global Witness, would raise around 20 billion in the next decade. So that's kind of on the polluting companies side of things. And then on taxing the super rich individuals, this is where the focus of our work lies at Tax Justice. And we're always sort of trying to give this message that there is more than enough money in the UK. We don't have to be looking at things like cuts to public services, raising income tax on ordinary people. The UK has the sixth biggest economy in the world and a rising number of billionaires and super rich. There's no reason why we can't ensure that all of our communities can be living comfortably and not struggling to make ends meet. So our main ask is around a 2% annual tax on wealth over 10 million to raise over 24 billion a year, which, to put it into context, is more than 5 times what the government was considering taking from disabled people's essential support back in May. And would also tackle inequality in the long term. And I'm sure you've heard or seen that the call for a wealth tax is gaining a lot of traction and momentum, which has been really exciting to see. Though, to be realistic, we don't expect it to see it in next month's budget, unfortunately, as much as we would like to. So, in terms of some of the other policies that we might see some progress on in this budget, we're calling for policies that would equalise the way our tax system treats income from wealth and work. So currently we have a tax system in the UK which is very regressive, very outdated, and very unfair, and taxes income from wealth at a much lower rate than income from work. So two things that we would like to see the government do to change this. Number one would be equalising capital gains tax rates with income tax. Even though the Chancellor did increase capital gains tax rates at last year's budget, which was encouraging to see, they're still the lowest rates in the G7, which is, yeah, and she was sort of boasting about that at one point, which is, yeah, not so encouraging to see. And means that people who make their money sort of passive income from assets and wealth are paying around half the rate of tax than the rest of us who make our incomes through working. And then the second one is around applying national insurance contributions to investment income. So things like interest on savings, income from rent, dividends from shares. So you might have heard in the news floats rumours of a tax on landlords. We don't think it's fair or right that landlords who don't have a mortgage should pay a lower rate of tax than the tenants who would be working for a living. So We have policy documents that we can share that outline all of these policies in more detail. But essentially, all of the policies that we are advocating for would try and equalize and make fairer the way the tax system treats income from wealth and work, so that it crucially tackles inequality in the longer term. Um, I think that's the final slide now. If you could move, yeah. Actually, no, there's two more, but thanks. So thinking about what we're up against, and it is a lot. Sometimes we refer to them as the wealth lobby, a small but very loud and powerful group of super rich people in this country who have a lot of influence over the media and too often have the ear of government too. I think I heard a stat when I was at Labour conference that lobbyist groups, lobbyist groups get 23 times the number of meetings with ministers that those of us who work for charities and organisations do. So that's a sort of sign of what we are up against in terms of influence and contact. And yes, as many of you will know more about than me, the same goes for the fossil fuel industry, a very rich and powerful industry with a very loud voice and influence. So that we are up against a lot. And in terms of the main myths that you hear about some of the taxes we've been talking about today, thinking specifically around wealth taxes, the main two I would say are, and I'm sort of loath to repeat these lines, but I feel like we're all on the same side here. But the like capital flight argument, won't all the rich people leave? And then there's like the administrative point around a wealth tax would never work in practice. It's never worked overseas or in history. And then on the climate side, this kind of idea that voters don't really care about the climate or net zero and this kind of thing. So yeah, we are up against a lot with all of that. But we have some thoughts and ideas on how we can present alternatives. So if you go to the final slide. Thanks. Um, we have coming out at the end of this week actually a document that we've put together of sort of key lines to rebut those specific myths and give people really useful facts and figures. Things like on the capital flight point, for example, a lot of the data that you saw in media stories was wildly sensationalized and pulled out of context, and a lot of it actually found to be quite baseless and for example, it was based on someone had gone through Henley and Partners who were behind this stat that was something, I can't remember what percent of millionaires they said would be leaving the UK. It was based on a guy going on LinkedIn and seeing how many people had changed their location on LinkedIn and extracting from that all these people had left the UK. Like it was ridiculously, yeah, not to be taken seriously. But the story got out, the newspapers splash it everywhere. So we have some really helpful facts and figures on those main arguments that I can share by the end of this week. But I would say on the sort of bigger points, I do think that point I've already made, but tax being a solution to the problem and a kind of tangible answer to that question of like, how are we going to make this happen? How will we pay for climate action? How are we going to pay for this specific program to support local communities at the forefront of climate emergency in the UK, for example, like progressive tax reform provides an answer there. I think the second thing to say is that, as many will know, there is massive public support for these issues. Like 75%, a YouGov poll recently found that 75% of the general public are supportive of a wealth tax, and that includes a majority of reform voters. And similarly, 78% support making polluters pay for climate damage. And again, that includes a majority of reform voters. I don't know if people have already seen, but a few months back now, there was a really fascinating piece of research out by the organisation Persuasion, looking at reform curious Labour voters and making the CEOs of fossil fuel companies, of private water companies, pay their fair share of taxes was up there with a really popular ask from reform curious Labour voters. So there is a lot here that we can be saying to MPs. This is a voters' issue. This is something that your constituents care about. And I think a way to really do that is to try and make these issues as local to constituents as possible. So we're always trying to think about like I mean, I guess with climate damage, it feels a little bit more straightforward. You can show the impacts of that at home, like the impacts of flooding, high energy bills, the like crop losses, all of these things. When it comes to wealth taxation, we're always trying to think of kind of creative and localized ways that we can show the impacts of not having these taxes in place. So cuts to people's services, local library closures, like all the things that we can point to and say, if we had better and more taxes on wealth, we would have a huge amount more revenue to be able to pay to invest in local communities. Um, and I think there's a really interesting point here on the political context. Obviously, we've seen a very concerning rise of popularity on the far right and of reform, and then more recently, this surge in the Greens. And I think on both sides, well, we know that what that shows is that people are seeking across the country and across the political spectrum real meaningful change to their living standards, to their material conditions, to the political picture, and to their hope and opportunities for the future. And bold economic reform through making polluters pay, through taxing the super rich, it creates space to really push on those issues because they provide an answer to some of these problems. So we're more and more trying to talk about our policies and progressive tax reform in that wider political context and saying we're seeing people turn on each other. Our communities are being divided. People are looking to blame migrants, to blame minoritized groups. If we were taxing the super rich, then we would have a lot more money in our communities to raise living standards, to invest in public services, and people wouldn't be struggling to make ends meet and more vulnerable to these sort of radicalizing politics. Um, and I think like the government and Labour more generally are really afraid of the rise of reform. They're taking it seriously. So it's really about showing them that these issues matter to these voters, and why they matter to their constituents. Um, so to us, it's very clear that this is an issue of political will, not of lack of public support or lack of understanding necessarily. It's one of political will. So it's about getting the government to see that these are issues that people really care about, making them tangible in local issues, and showing what progressive tax reform could really bring to communities, to the future of our communities as well, both in terms of inequality and funding climate action as well. Um, like in whenever we're talking about our climate and tax reforms, it's always trying where we can to frame them in for the government. And the UK has made this commitment to become a clean energy superpower. Here's how we can help get there. And also on the other side of that, here's how it will support your constituents. Um, and then just to end on some key messages when we're thinking about tax, some of the things that we are always trying to do is to sort of think about and make explicit who the enemies are or who the agents are. Maybe enemies is a bit too sort of divisive, but thinking about who are the agents that are at the root of the issues we're talking about. So whether that's fossil fuel CEOs, billionaires, politicians themselves, trying to talk about extreme or obscene wealth and make it tangible. For a lot of the time, the thing that we're met with is like, this is just politics of envy, you're anti-ambition. People seek to be wealthy and they seek to make their families better off, and that isn't something we're trying to attack. And we're sort of trying to always send the message that the people we are talking about, this is a wealth that is hard to even get our heads around. We're not talking about sort of everyday people who want to be able to help their kids get on the property ladder if they can. We're talking about the super rich, the CEOs of these massive companies who are seeing their profits soar while the rest of our communities are struggling. And then finally, just a note on always where we can framing tax in a positive light. So talking about the contribution or the investment that people can make to our society, and to the world we want to build together rather than a burden, or something negative. Um, I will stop there because I've spoken for a while. And yeah, it'd be nice for it to be more of a discussion. But yeah, any questions, let me know.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Caitlin, so much. Right on schedule, but thanks. Really quite shocking stats, and yeah, we've got plenty of time for questions. Let me just stop sharing the slides. Feel free to pop questions in the chat, or you can use the raise hand function as well. Yeah, go for it, Annie.
Hi, Caitlin. Thank you so much. That was super interesting. And sorry, I am actually from Project Boost, but I had a question, so I'm taking prerogative. This might totally be exposing my lack of knowledge of the tax system, but I just wondered what might need to change to enable some of these progressive taxes to be implemented, and whether, I mean, we hear a lot kind of about like data sharing and targeting between departments, and just wondering if that's something that applies here and if there's any calls on the kind of underlying fundamentals that need to change. Thanks.
Yeah, definitely. And I actually thought halfway through, oh, I'd forgotten to mention that. So that's really good that you asked that question. But yeah, so one of the other things that we're going to be really focusing on ahead of this budget, probably more in our sort of internal policy work, because it's not very sexy and exciting for the public, but like this idea of building institutional capacity within HMRC to enable them to properly measure and collect tax from the very richest. So um, as it stands, HMRC has very little idea about the tax affairs of the super rich in this country. There was a really quite damning report out this summer by the Public Accounts Committee that found that HMRC don't even know how many billionaires there are, what the offshore tax gap is, which is an important one for the super rich because lots of them are keeping their money in tax havens like the UK's overseas territories and crown dependencies. And their estimation of the offshore tax gap from the wealthy is about 2 billion, but it's likely to be huge, like significantly higher than that. So, and some really sort of shocking findings like HMRC used to have a high net worth individuals unit that would measure the wealth of, it would measure and collect taxes from people with wealth over 10 million, and they disbanded that in 2017. So they now have, they measure the wealthy as a, I can't remember the exact threshold, but it's something like a salary of over 200,000 a year and wealth of over 1 or 2 million, which is obviously wealthy if we're thinking relatively speaking, but it's not the super rich and the people that we're looking at targeting. And it's also a much bigger group of people, so it's harder to administer. So one of the key things that we're saying is like, you need to reinstate that group. You need to ensure that there are people with the skills and expertise in HMRC to properly be able to go after that tax and measure it and collect it. Um, and I think it's a really interesting call because it's something that people across the political spectrum can really get behind, like the more moderate, soft centre Labour MPs who would never call for a wealth tax, but would agree that we need a well-functioning HMRC that can properly collect the tax it's owed. But actually, these are the infrastructural changes that would be needed to enable a wealth tax within this parliament as well. Um, and just on that, the New Economics Foundation have a report coming out, I think, later this month on exactly this, like looking in loads of detail at like exactly what would be needed to change within HMRC to make this stuff possible. Um, so yeah, keep an eye out for that. Should be really interesting.
Thanks, Annie. I can't see any other questions at the moment, so I'll just give it a few seconds or so. Yes, Matthew.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, that was really, really interesting. So I work for Hope for the Future, and we've been helping people speak to their politicians about this, and people seem really engaged. I think it's such a nice, it's so solutions focused, as you were mentioning. Like, it's great to have something that we can get people speaking to their politicians that is not a complaint necessarily. It's a, okay, this is how you fix the problem. So yeah, excited. I suppose my question is around who are the big blockers to this. So particularly if we're helping people speak to MPs, are there any like key target MPs? Is it, I suppose, Rachel Reeves that is blocking this? Is it Keir Starmer? Is it a wider feeling within the cabinet?
Yeah, thanks. And great to hear that you're doing this with constituents because that's, yeah, something that we really want to do more of, but don't have a huge amount of capacity is like mobilizing our supporters to take, I mean, we do it where we can, but would love to be able to do more on that side. Um, I think I think it's a mix. Sort of, I've been feeling sort of extra frustrated recently with, and I don't know if others felt this who maybe were at conference or just generally do advocacy work, like the level of caution that we're seeing among Labour MPs around talking about wealth taxes or progressive tax reform or making polluters pay. Like, as one example, we helped out with the Make Polluters Pay stall at Labour conference, and two MPs who had come and had their photo taken with the stall then came back and said, actually, can you delete that photo because it's going to get me in trouble? One was Katie White, the climate minister, but one yeah, I don't know. It was disappointing. So I think there is a lot of fear and a lot, especially after the rebellion around the disability cuts. I think MPs are being especially sort of risk averse and ahead of the budget, especially in talking about tax. So I would say like any MPs, which is so many, but any MPs who are sort of soft centre left, it's good to just because around the disability cuts, for example, I think lots of people were lobbied by their constituents and told, can't you tax wealth as an alternative? We don't want to see cuts. And it actually we really saw the traction that was having. Amongst MPs coming to us and saying, I'd like to be able to advocate for wealth taxes, but I really want to feel confident in it. Can you send me some lines and briefings? So I mean, the obvious targets would be, yeah, treasury ministers, that kind of thing. But I would say that in general, just targeting the soft centre left of Labour, non-socialist campaign group, not the Greens. Lib Dems are pretty good on this stuff, but the MPs who might sit, like our targets are often like MPs on the Treasury Select Committee, on the APPG for responsible tax, like those who will have kind of indirect influence, backbenchers with an interest in this area. Because yeah, I think constituency campaigning is such a good way for those who might not ideologically support these issues, but then they will if they see that it matters for their voters, basically. Yeah, those are my initial thoughts. Good luck with it.
Thanks, Matthew. I'll just take one question from the chat before I come back to the raised hand, but I've got a question from Emily who says, I'm curious as to whether there is solid academic research speaking to, e.g., all the wealth will leave, and are there partners in the voluntary sector can work with to deliver these messages so that it is heard?
Yeah, definitely. So yes, there is solid academic research debunking that myth, which will all be in this document that I can share at the end of this week. But for like as a kind of initial example, the Tax Justice Network, who are sort of the European equivalent of us, put out a report when there were all these media reports going around about this millionaire exodus, showing why that wasn't the case. And there's been some really brilliant research by Centax, so Aaron Advani and Andy Summers, looking at international examples and also looking at the migratory responses to the changes to the non-dom scheme in the UK in 2017 and how they were actually very minimal. Also, the wealth tax that we advocate for, the 2% on assets over 10 million, the revenue estimations of that already include a behavioural response. And we can talk about things like I think it's actually important to sort of not be too black and white on either side. Like the overwhelming research shows that the vast majority of the super rich would stay in their countries, but it is probably worth saying there will be some people who will follow the money and like first of all, fine, let them go, but also like we can talk about stuff like exit taxes that we can implement to protect against those greedy few who do want to just follow the money, you know. And then on Voices, our sister organisation is the Patriotic Millionaires UK. So they're an incredibly effective and powerful voice. And it's just really interesting every time you see them at an MP event or something. Like the first thing an MP who's opposed to this stuff will say is, but what about the rich people? Won't they leave? And if you have a multi-millionaire standing there saying, I'm proud to pay and I'm here to stay, there is nothing that they can say to argue with that, really. It's very, very effective, and I'm really glad that they exist. So yeah, check out more of their work. And they've got a few members who speak a lot on climate stuff as well. Yeah.
Yeah, super interesting. April.
Oh yeah, thanks for that. It's kind of following on from the last question is yes, Picture of Millionaires are great, but I was kind of wish, is there any other voices that we can, as a more of an ENGO sector, I suppose, coming from my point of view, that we could press on? Because as my organisation, it is not necessarily a natural place that we would talk about this to our supporters, but if we can push other organisations and voices, particularly more centrist, I suppose I'm asking for as well. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think like something that we're looking at trying to do ahead of the budget is like some kind of an open letter or statement from not necessarily the multimillionaires, but wealthy people who would be impacted, say, by changes to capital gains tax, but still support them. So I think there is a gap in terms of like big business voices and stuff like that. That's not to say that they don't exist and aren't supportive, but I think that is a gap in the movement and something that we have talked about. We need to hear more of these voices. I think it has been really encouraging over the last year to see unions, like the big major unions, come out in support of taxing wealth more. And again, I know that unions will be perceived as lefty by a lot of people, but to have unions like the TUC and GMB and others that represent a lot of public sector workers come out and say, yes, we should be having wealth taxes to avoid public sector cuts to support workers is really encouraging. And we coordinated a letter from 30 global leading economists around wealth taxes a few months back as well. So having kind of those academic economist voices is always helpful. There is actually also a poll from Patriotic Millionaires did a poll of MPs that found a majority of MPs were supportive as well if it was used to fund public services. Can try and find that and put it in the chat. But yeah, any voices that can be mobilized is always something we're looking for.
Thanks, April. Apar. Oh, I don't think we can hear you. Although you're not on mute, so I'm not sure.
Is it the headphones maybe?
No, it's not working. Do you want to type it in the chat, Apar, and I'll read it out?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Annie figured it out. I was muted on my headphones. Yeah. My question was, what are your thoughts on, and I'm sorry if you covered this and I missed it, on a land value tax? And the second part of that question was also, how do you go about taxing like expensive things that rich people own? Like, I don't know if this counts as like an asset, but like a really expensive bag, like a yacht, or is the yacht, because it doesn't stay here, is that something else? But you get what I mean.
Yeah. Yeah, no, good question. On the land value tax, it's not something that we explicitly or actively campaign on ourselves. Like, I think our clear position is that council tax is one of the most regressive, outdated forms of taxation that exists and needs complete overhaul / abolition when replacement with something much more progressive. Some people advocate for a land value tax, others talk about proportional property taxes. Where we have talked about it, we've pointed towards proportional property taxes as land value taxes sound really, to be completely honest, I don't know a huge amount, but from what the research we have done, and we've done a fair bit of internal conversation around this, is that they sound and are a great idea in principle, but haven't worked very well in practice. And a proportional property tax is what we would probably advocate for. And on the valuing of assets, yes, there are challenges that would come with a wealth tax because it's net assets, so it would be valuing all of someone's wealth. So it would rely on people on being able to value those things. So it's something that we would need to introduce would be like asset registers, which would allow and tax experts at Centax talk about, like, for inheritance tax, people have to value their wealth. So it could work in a similar way as it does for this. I heard someone say recently, like the super rich kind of are able to value their wealth all the time to sort of talk about how much wealth they hold. So clearly it can be done. We just want to use that for good. But I think in terms of that, it would be new. It would be a new process for HMRC. It doesn't mean it can't happen. There are ideas of the best ways to do that. But a crucial point is that the wealth tax that we're calling for would only impact 20,000 people, roughly, which is about the size of the O2 Arena. So it's a really small number of people, relatively speaking, which would make it much easier for HMRC to administer. So yeah, I think that's quite a key point in that.
Thanks, Apar. Did you have another? Yeah, go for it.
I don't know if this is allowed, yeah, but I've got a second part, which is, would you pay the tax like once on something expensive on your assets, or would you have to pay it like again and again?
So every year you would pay a 2% tax on any wealth you have over 10 million. So that's the part that often MPs I've spoken to are slightly confused about. They'll be like, yeah, is it 2% of 10 million? No. So say you had 12 million in assets, you pay 2% on the 2 million, yeah, the bit over. So you could say, yes, every year they're paying on that same amount of wealth, but it is just on the amount of wealth over that threshold. So it's people who can well afford to pay that bit extra. And I actually don't love this about the policy, but people's wealth, the people who have wealth at that level, it actually would continue increasing just at a slower rate. So it doesn't even stop ballooning wealth, but it slows down the rate.
Thank you so much.
Right.
Thanks. I'll just give it a moment in case there are any further questions. Yeah, Louis.
Thanks so much, Caitlin. It's been really, really useful. I guess you did touch on this, but I would be interested if you have any more thoughts about, from the perspective of tax justice and other folks campaigning on wealth taxes. Like, I know lots of climate allies are already working closely with you on this, but for others whose organizations haven't endorsed a wealth tax yet, like, what's most useful for you guys from other people in the climate movement, and particularly thinking about, you know, people playing different roles in the movement ecology? Like, do you think people should be like coming up with their own policy programs of tax changes they could support, signaling, you know, MPs or media towards you guys? Like, what would you recommend?
Thanks. That's really helpful. I mean, kind of all the above. I would say that it's a good flag actually to mention. I think on the point that I touched on around like partnership and collaborative work, like that is something that's been really brilliant to see, both within the new economy space, but between the new economy space and other sectors like the climate sector. So we coordinate quite a few different working groups, and one of them is on climate and tax. We have a monthly call working group on taxing polluters fairly. So I'll put my colleagues' email in the chat, and if anyone is keen to join that, please do, because that we use that meeting to think about like where are the synergies, where are the interconnections, where can we work together, around like what policies. Like I would, I'm biased, but would say like if you're going to call for a wealth tax, it probably is most helpful to have to ascribe to the same policy. But having said that, like Greenpeace call for a slightly different wealth tax. There are different ones floating around, like the Green Party, for example. I've heard Zach Polanski talk about a 1% tax on the super rich. So I think as long as we're all singing from the same hymn sheet in that we need to equalize the way the tax system treats wealth and work, and we need to tax wealth more. That's the main message. And with media, if you get requests or things around like specific to the budget or wealth taxes, feel free. We have like 3 or 4 of us as spokespeople, so always happy to take those kind of calls. But I think in general, just like making links wherever we can. Like, for example, COP's coming up, like talking about kind of how like some of the links we've been talking about this is separate to this call, but like the need for a UN for the UK to support a UN tax convention, which is currently in the works, and the potential that a convention on tax would have for being able to bring in more taxes, climate and tax at the local level that would be making global polluters pay better, fairer allocation of taxing rights, more taxes on wealth. So drawing those links wherever we can. So I would say just, come along to some of these working groups if you're interested, and then we can sort of take it from there. I'll put my colleagues thing now.
Thanks, Louis. Really key question there. Annie.
Yeah, sorry, me again, but sorry, it's just so interesting. I had to ask a second question. I was going to say, you mentioned at the beginning one of the main myths that you hear is around the fact that it just hasn't worked elsewhere. And I wondered sort of what your top examples that work to that question would be, because I feel like I always get it wrong when people ask me kind of in a friendship context. So would be keen to hear what you would say.
Yeah, definitely. So again, this will be part of what's clearly outlined in this document that we'll share. But off the top of my head, like the examples, there's a few different international examples. Norway is often used as a positive example, and Spain as another example of a country that has increased its revenue off the back of a wealth tax. Often people use France as an example of where it hasn't worked and where they had to get rid of it and change it. And so we try and sort of say that like there are international examples we can look to. However, there are also lessons that we can learn from those international examples where they haven't worked. Like in France, it was a much lower threshold, so it was much harder to administer. And it also targeted people who we wouldn't necessarily call the super rich. So there's where we can't necessarily take examples, like there are always lessons that can be learned from that. And like Switzerland is a funny example because they have like so many tax loopholes and stuff, but it is also a country that has a wealth tax and lots of super rich people still go there. So there are a few different international examples, but I would say that Norway is probably the best one.
Thanks, Annie. Sophie.
Hi, thanks. I had a question about the politics. Obviously, it's much more of a kind of lefty issue, and like you said, being championed by the Greens at the moment. And I think it's sensible to target kind of left-leaning Labour MPs. But I just wondered what you thought about kind of Reform's positioning, because obviously they're socially very conservative, but economically a bit more kind of variable. And there are some of their supporters that would support a wealth tax. Are you doing any work to kind of mobilise Reform voters or Reform curious voters to push them in that direction, or do you think it's just way too much of a long shot because Reform's literally funded by millionaires and billionaires, so it doesn't seem a natural fit there? But I just wonder if there's kind of a groundswell across the political spectrum in terms of the electorate. How do you see that playing out? Are you actually trying to avoid it because you don't want it to be weaponized by them? Yeah, just interested in the politics side.
Yeah, definitely. So, yeah, I think we need to separate out, as you have, like Reform MPs from Reform voters, because I think they are standing for two wildly different things. And we haven't and probably won't try and bother engaging Reform MPs, like they're backed by billionaires, everything, yeah, you've just said. Their interests are not with ordinary people and making the country a better place. However, Reform voters or Reform curious voters, we definitely do want to try and engage and understand that for a lot of people, that political leaning or curiosity is coming from a place of being like things have been really bad for a really long time and they're looking for change. And what I mentioned in the last slide around like, I think the rise of popularity of Reform and the Greens, both, although they are very different, really open up space to push for bold economic change and things like taxes on wealth, because on both sides, people are looking for change and don't see Labour as the answer to that. Right now, we're focusing very much on the budget, but after that, we'll be looking ahead to the local elections next May. And I think we are going to try and think about doing things like mobilising or getting people to target their MPs. We have over 60,000 supporters who sign up to our weekly newsletter, are very engaged and take action when we ask them to, which is great. So things like working out which supporters we have in constituencies that are particularly at risk of swinging to Reform and getting them to write to their MP to talk about taxing wealth, and that kind of thing. So yeah, very much hope others are kind of thinking along the same lines. We'll be interested to know what people's plans are in that area before the locals, because we're likely to see a swing towards Reform. So I think it might be a point at which Labour MPs are more open to some of these suggestions. Fingers crossed.
Super, thanks, Sophie. I should give it a moment again in case there's any last questions. We've still got 10 minutes if anyone does have any questions. Okay, great. Well, massive thank you to Caitlin. That's been such an interesting discussion. Really smashed all the questions that came your way, and thanks as well to our audience just for coming up with those questions. The only other thing to say is that, as I mentioned, the recording and slides will be shared on our website afterwards, and please feel free to share them with any colleagues in case they missed this. But otherwise, thanks again, Caitlin, and
Thanks
see you
very
all
much
soon.
for having me. Thanks for everyone. See you later.